The rifle barrel points down at a man bleeding into volcanic ash. The wounded Japanese soldier's eyes meet those of the American Marines standing above him. Protocol is clear. Eliminate all enemy combatants. The wounded are still dangerous. They carry grenades. They feign death and detonate explosives when medics approach. Every manual, every briefing, every bitter lesson learned in blood across 1,000 Pacific islands screams one truth: don't trust a wounded enemy. Yet in this moment on Iwo Jima's black sand, something fundamental shifts. The Marine lowers his weapon. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. March 1945. The Pacific War has devolved into something beyond conventional warfare. It is industrial-scale killing compressed into spaces measured in yards. Iwo Jima is 8 square miles of volcanic rock where 70,000 men will fight for 36 days. The mathematics are brutal. 1 American casualty for every square yard gained. The Japanese have transformed the island into a subterranean fortress with 11 miles of tunnels, concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, and artillery pieces hidden in caves that can strike any point on Iceland. They will not surrender. Their orders forbid it. The Senjinkan military code states explicitly that capture is worse than death. A Japanese soldier who allows himself to be taken prisoner brings eternal shame upon his family and dishonors the emperor. This is not hyperbole. It is doctrine reinforced by years of indoctrination. The American forces have learned to expect this fanaticism. At Saipan in June 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs rather than accept American occupation. Mothers threw their children into the sea before leaping after them. The Marines watched in horror as entire families chose death. At Tarawa the previous year, of the 4,800 Japanese defenders, only 17 allowed themselves to be captured alive. The rest fought until killed or committed suicide with grenades pressed to their chests. This pattern has repeated across every island: Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Guam, Tinian. The Pacific War is not like Europe. There are no mass surrenders, no white flags, just fighting that continues until one side is annihilated. This reality has fundamentally altered American combat doctrine. The official policy states that Japanese prisoners will be accepted if they surrender. The practical reality differs sharply. Marines have learned through brutal experience that a wounded Japanese soldier is often as dangerous as a healthy one. The tactic is common. A soldier lies motionless, apparently dead or dying, clutching a grenade beneath his body. When Americans approach to check the body or render aid, the grenade detonates. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, a Navy surgeon bent over a wounded Japanese soldier to administer care. The soldier seized a scalpel from the medical kit and plunged it into the surgeon's back. The doctor survived, but the lesson was learned and transmitted throughout the Pacific Theater. Wounded enemy personnel represent a continuing threat. The rules of engagement evolve accordingly. Officers instruct their men to approach all Japanese casualties with extreme caution. Some units adopt unofficial policies that are more direct. Finish them. Make certain. Take no chances. This is not presented as murder, but as tactical necessity. A wounded soldier left behind the advancing line can recover enough to throw a grenade at following units. He might have a rifle within reach. He might simply be waiting for darkness to crawl to a better position. The safest protocol is to ensure that every enemy soldier encountered is confirmed dead. A second shot. A bayonet thrust. Then move forward. The fighting is too intense and the stakes too high to take risks with enemy wounded. Yet despite this harsh calculus, individual Marines make different choices. They see something in that moment when a wounded man looks up at them. They recognize what they are supposed to ignore, that the person bleeding into the ground is human, that he is probably 19 or 20 years old, that he is conscripted from some farming village and indoctrinated into a militaristic cult that demands his death, that he is terrified. The official narrative presents Japanese soldiers as fanatics eager to die for the emperor. The reality is more complex. Many Japanese soldiers fight ferociously, not because they embrace death, but because they fear the consequences of surrender more. They have been told that Americans torture prisoners, that capture means brutal interrogation followed by execution. Their officer-chief told them that the American Marines are devils who will bayonet wounded men and desecrate corpses. Both sides have dehumanized the other to make killing easier. Private First Class Desmond Doss lands on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, with the 77th Infantry Division. He is a combat medic who refuses to carry a weapon. This puts him in a unique category. The U.S. military allows conscientious objectors to serve in non-combat roles, but Doss insists on serving as a frontline medic with an infantry company. His religious convictions as a Seventh-day Adventist forbid him from taking life. He interprets the Sixth Commandment literally, "Thou shalt not kill." His fellow soldiers view him with contempt. They call him a coward. They question his manhood. One soldier openly states that he will ensure Doss does not return alive from combat. The company's officers attempt multiple times to have him transferred or discharged. They consider him a liability. A soldier who refuses to fire a weapon cannot be trusted to protect his comrades. Doss endures this hostility without complaint. He maintains his convictions while performing his duties. He trains with his unit, learning to move under fire and administer battlefield medicine. He carries a medical kit instead of a rifle. He studies anatomy and trauma care. He practices evacuating wounded men under simulated combat conditions. He is slight of build, weighing perhaps 140 pounds, but he is determined. His faith drives him. He believes God has called him to save lives, not take them. This conviction will be tested in ways he cannot imagine. The Battle of Okinawa begins with a massive naval bombardment. American battleships and cruisers fire thousands of shells into the Japanese defensive positions. The island is 82 miles long and varies from 2 to 18 miles wide. It is defended by 130,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. The Japanese strategy is to bully the Americans through prolonged defensive warfare. They will not contest the beaches. Instead, they have constructed 3 defensive lines across the southern portion of the island, anchored on ridges and hills fortified with concrete and steel. The Mata Escarpment, which Americans will call Hacksaw Ridge, is a natural fortress. It is a limestone cliff approximately 400 feet high with sheer faces that make frontal assault nearly suicidal. The Japanese have honeycombed the ridgeline with caves and tunnels. Artillery pieces are hidden in positions that can fire and then be withdrawn into the cliff face before counter battery. Fire rifts. The 77th Division receives orders to capture Hacksaw Ridge on April 29, 1945. The initial assaults fail. Japanese machine gun fire from concealed positions cuts down advancing troops. Mortar shells rain down from positions the Americans cannot locate. Soldiers reach top of the escarpment using cargo nets and rope ladders, only to be driven back by fierce Sekenarats. The fighting is savage. Men grapple hand-to-hand in the confined spaces off the ridgetop. Grenades are thrown at distances measured in feet. The wounded lie where they fall because movement draws fire. On May 5th, Doss's company reaches the top of Hacksaw Ridge after a brutal climb. They establish a tenuous foothold and begin expanding their perimeter. For several hours, it appears they might hold the position. Then the Japanese launch a massive counterattack. Hundreds of soldiers emerge from tunnels and caves. They charge the American positions in waves, accepting enormous casualties to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. The Americans are stunned by the ferocity. Officers shout orders to fall back. The only escape route is back down the cliff face. Soldiers scramble for the ropes and cargo nets. Men are shot in the back as they climb down. Others lose their grip and fall. The retreat becomes a rout. Desmond Doss refuses to leave. The escarpment's top is littered with American wounded. Some cry out for help. Others lie silent, too injured to move or unconscious from blood loss. Doss estimates there are 50 to 100 wounded men scattered across the ridge. Japanese soldiers are advancing, executing the wounded as they encounter them. The doctrine is the same on both sides. Wounded enemy personnel cannot be left to potentially recover and fight again. Doss makes a decision that violates every principle of self-preservation. He will stay and evacuate the wounded, alone, without a weapon. With Japanese troops actively hunting him, he moves across the battlefield in a crouch, keeping to whatever cover exists. He reaches a wounded soldier and quickly assesses the injuries. Sucking chest wound. Doss applies a pressure dressing and ties it tight. The soldier is conscious but weak from blood loss. Doss drags him to the cliff edge. He has fashioned a rope litter using a double bowline knot, creating a loop that goes under the wounded man's arms. Doss lowers him down the cliff face, hand over hand, the rope burning through his palms. When the soldier reaches the bottom, medics below untie the rope and Doss pulls it back up. Then he crawls back into the kill zone to find another wounded man. He repeats this process throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Each trip across the exposed ridgetop risks death. Japanese soldiers are still on the escarpment, moving through the American positions. Doss can hear them speaking. He lies flat when they pass nearby, praying they will not see him. He works in a fugue state, driven by purpose that transcends fear. He finds a soldier with both legs shattered by a mortar shell. The man is screaming. Doss administers morphine from a syringe, applies tourniquets, and drags him to the cliff edge. Another soldier has taken multiple bullet wounds to the abdomen. He is semi-conscious and going into shock. Doss wraps him in a poncho to maintain body heat and lowers him down. Hours pass. Doss loses count of how many men he has evacuated. His arms tremble from exhaustion. His hands are raw and bloody from the rope. Dehydration makes his head pound. He has given away his canteen water to wounded men. Still, he continues. He finds soldiers in shell holes, in shallow trenches, lying behind rocks. Some recognize him and thank him. Others are too far gone to speak. Doss works mechanically. Assess, treat, evacuate. Hesitantly prays between each rescue. Lord, help me get one more. Just one more. Then I'll go down. But he never goes down. There is always one more. He finds a soldier who has been bayoneted, the blade having passed completely through his shoulder. The man is still breathing but unconscious. Doss cannot remove the blade without causing fatal hemorrhaging. He stabilizes the soldier as best he can and gets him to the cliff edge. He finds another man who is awake and mobile despite multiple shrapnel wounds. Together, they carry a third soldier who has lost a leg. Doss ties the tourniquet so tight the wounded man screams. Darkness falls. Japanese voices come closer. Doss hears the metallic click of rifle bolts being worked. He lies next to a wounded soldier, both of them pressed into a shallow depression in the ground. Japanese soldiers walk past, silhouetted against the twilight sky. They are researching for American wounded to finish them. Doss holds his breath. The soldiers move on after they pass. Doss continues his work. He uses darkness as cover, crawling across the ridge top and finding wounded men by their moans. He whispers to them, "Stay quiet. I'll get you out." Near midnight, he has evacuated everyone he can find. Approximately 75 men have been lowered down the cliff face alive. Some die of their wounds later. Most survive because Desmond Doss refused to obey the order to retreat. He finally climbs down the cargo net, his strength nearly gone. At the bottom, his company commander approaches. Captain Jack Glover, who once tried to have Doss transferred out of the company, stands speechless. Glover was one of the men Doss evacuated. He had been wounded on the ridge, and Doss had lowered him to safety. Now Glover grasps Doss's hand. "You did it," he says. "You realitted it." The story spreads rapidly through the division. Soldiers who called Doss a coward now call him the bravest man they have ever seen. He becomes a living legend. Officers cite him as evidence that moral courage is as important as physical courage. He has demonstrated that saving lives requires as much strength as taking them. But the story takes on additional demands when soldiers begin to report something unexpected. During his evacuation efforts, Desmond Doss did not discriminate by nationality. Among the American wounded he saved, there were Japanese casualties as well. The accounts are fragmentary but consistent. Multiple soldiers report seeing Doss render medical aid to wounded Japanese soldiers on Hacksaw Ridge. He applied bandages, administered morphine. He gave water from his canteen. He did not evacuate them down that cliff. His priority was American casualties, but he did not leave them to die when he could prevent it. This behavior is extraordinary. It violates both official doctrine and practical common sense. Helping a wounded enemy soldier uses medical supplies that might be needed for American casualties. It exposes the medic to danger if the wounded soldier chooses to detonate a grenade or pull a concealed weapon. It consumes time that could be spent finding American wounded. Yet, Doss's religious convictions compel him to help anyone who suffers. The Sixth Commandment does not specify nationality. His duty as a medic is to preserve life. He sees a wounded Japanese soldier the same way he sees a wounded American, as a human being in need of care. This perspective is alien to most combat soldiers in the Pacific Theater. They have been trained to see the Japanese as fundamentally different. Propaganda portrays them as subhuman, as fanatics who choose death over dishonor, as an enemy so foreign in thought and culture that normal rules do not apply. Doss rejects this dehumanization. He treats enemy wounded because it is the right thing to do according to his faith. He does not expect gratitude or recognition. He does not do it to prove a point. He does it because his conscience demands it. This makes him unusual even among medics. Most combat medics in the Pacific Theater focus exclusively on American casualties. The fighting is too intense and the medical supplies too limited to waste resources on enemy wounded. Field hospitals are overwhelmed with American casualties. Every bandage and syringe of morphine used on a Japanese soldier is one less available for an American. The military's official position on treating enemy wounded is clear in theory but murky in practice. The Geneva Convention requires that medical personnel provide care to enemy wounded when feasible. The reality is that feasible allows considerable interpretation. In the Pacific Theater, it is rarely deemed feasible. Japanese soldiers so infrequently surrender that most American troops have never seen a Japanese prisoner. The few who do surrender are usually so badly wounded they cannot continue fighting. They are evacuated to rear areas for intelligence interrogation. The walking wounded and those with minor injuries almost never surrender. They return to combat or commit suicide. This creates a situation where American soldiers develop a practical calculus. A wounded Japanese soldier who is conscious and mobile is still a combatant. He may have a weapon. He may be waiting for an opportunity to kill Americans. The safest course is to eliminate death rate. A wounded soldier who's unconscious or clearly dying presents a different equation. He is no longer a threat. Military necessity does not require his execution. But the question becomes, Why waste medical supplies on an enemy who will either die of his wounds or, if he survives, provide minimal intelligence value? Into this harsh pragmatism comes men like Desmond Doss, who operate from different principles. They see individual human beings rather than strategic assets or threats. They apply their moral code consistently regardless of uniform or flag. This perspective marks them as strange to their fellow soldiers. Some view them as admirable. Others consider them dangerously naive. All recognize them as different. The question of how to treat enemy wounded becomes more complex as the Pacific War progresses. By 1944, American intelligence has recognized that Japanese prisoners can provide valuable information about enemy dispositions, morale, and capabilities. The Office of War Information launches a campaign to encourage prisoner-taking. Leaflets are dropped over Japanese positions offering safe conduct to those who surrender. The text is in Japanese and promises humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Thelophlaes are largely ineffective. Japanese soldiers have been told the leaflets are propagandized to trick them. Their officers reinforce the message that Americans torture prisoners. Some units develop more creative approaches to capturing prisoners. On Saipan in June 1944, an 18-year-old Marine named Guy Gabaldon employs an unusual tactic. Gabaldon was raised in Los Angeles by a Japanese-American family before the war. He speaks fluent Japanese. He understands Japanese culture and the Bushido warrior code that drives enemy soldiers to choose death. He uses this knowledge to talk Japanese soldiers into surrendering. Gabaldon conducts his operations independently, often without permission from his officers. He moves at night into no man's land between the American and Japanese lines. He approaches Japanese positions and calls out in Japanese. He tells them that continuing to fight is pointless. The Americans have already won. Their situation is hopeless. Dying in a futile defense serves no purpose. He promises them they will not be tortured or executed. He says that surrendering is not shameful when continuing to fight would waste their lives for no strategic gain. This message, delivered in perfect Japanese by someone who understands your cultural framework, proves remarkably effective. Gabaldon captures his first Japanese prisoners through a combination of boldness and understanding of Japanese military hierarchy. He locates a Japanese cave position and calls out that he wants to negotiate. He says he has 2 companies of Marines ready to assault the position. He offers the Japanese soldiers a choice: die pointlessly or surrender with honor. Crucially, he addresses his words to the senior-ranking soldier, showing respect for a military protocol. After extended negotiation, 2 Japanese soldiers emerge. Gabaldon convinces them to return to the cave and bring out others. Eventually, a group of 50 soldiers emerge and surrenders. Gabaldon refines this technique over subsequent nights. His highest toll comes when he convinces 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender in a single morning on July 81,944. He locates a large group of Japanese troops and civilians who are trapped in a pocket with no escape route. Rather than allow them to be killed in an assault or commit suicide, Gabaldon spends hours negotiating. He uses a captured Japanese officer as an intermediary. He makes arguments about the worthlessness of dying when the war is already lost. He appeals to the Japanese soldiers' desire to see their families again. Gradually, the group surrenders. American officers are stunned when Gabaldon appears leading a column of 800 prisoners. It is the largest single capture of Japanese personnel in the Pacific War. Gabaldon's success demonstrates that some Japanese soldiers will surrender if approached correctly and if they believe surrender is more honorable than futile death. But his methods are impossible to replicate on a large scale. He succeeds because of his unique language skills and cultural knowledge. Most American troops lack this background. They cannot communicate with the enemy in any language but violence. The fighting remains brutal, and the casualty ratios remain horrific. The treatment of enemy wounded becomes a moral test that individual soldiers pass or fail based on their own character. Official policy states that enemy wounded will be treated humanly once captured. The practical implementation of this policy varies wildly. Some American soldiers treat Japanese prisoners with professional correctness. They provide medical care, water, and food. They evacuate them to rear areas for interrogation and then to prisoner of war camps. These camps in the United States are generally well run. Japanese prisoners receive adequate food, medical care, and housing. They are treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Many Japanese prisoners are shocked by this treatment. They expected torture and execution. Instead, they find themselves in facilities that provide better living conditions than they experienced in the Japanese army. Other American soldiers take a darker view. They have seen too many comrades killed by wounded Japanese soldiers who detonated grenades. They have witnessed too many suicide charges and too many atrocities committed against American prisoners. They know that the Japanese military routinely executes captured American soldiers or subjects them to brutal forced labor. They know about the Bataan Death March, where 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners were forced to march 65 miles with minimal food or water, and thousands died from execution, disease, or exhaustion. They know about the Burma Railway, where 16,000 Allied prisoners died constructing a railway under horrific conditions. They know about Japanese medical experiments on prisoners, about cannibalism at Shishijima, about systematic torture and murder. This knowledge hardens attitudes. Some American soldiers adopt a view that the Japanese have forfeited the right to humane treatment. They apply a rough justice. If the enemy does not follow the rules of war, why should we? This leads to incidents that are officially unique but widely known. Wounded Japanese soldiers are sometimes executed rather than evacuated for medical care. Prisoners are occasionally shot during transport with claims they were attempting escape. Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender are sometimes killed despite raising their hands or holding surrender leaflets. These actions violate military law and the Geneva Convention, but they are rarely prosecuted. The Pacific War is fought far from oversight, and the usual rules become suggestions. Yet simultaneously, there are Americans who maintain their humanity despite the war shores. They are medics like Desmond Doss who treat enemy wounded. They are Marines who share their water with wounded Japanese soldiers. They are officers who enforce proper treatment of prisoners, even when subordinates want to execute them. They are soldiers who recognize that how they fight matters as much as whether they win. These contradictions exist side by side throughout the Pacific Campaign. The same unit that commits atrocities one day might show mercy the next. The same soldier who bayonets a wounded enemy in one battle might render medical aid in another. The Pacific War strips away civilization's veneer and reveals what lies beneath. Humans are capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary compassion, often within the same person. The turning point comes not through policy changes but through individual encounters. A Marine stands over a wounded Japanese soldier and sees not an enemy but a dying boy. He makes a choice. He lowers his weapon. He calls for a medic. This decision ripples outward. His squad mates see his actions. Some disapprove. Others are moved. The wounded Japanese soldier survives and provides intelligence that saves American lives. Or he dies despite treatment, and his death serves no purpose except to let one American maintain his humanity. The outcome varies. The choice to offer mercy remains significant regardless. At Okinawa, the fighting continues for 82 days. It is the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The Americans suffer 49,000 casualties, including 12,500 killed. The Japanese suffer approximately 110,000 military deaths. Another 150,000 Okinawan civilians die, caught between the armies or committing suicide to avoid capture. The kamikaze attacks on the American fleet kill 4,900 sailors and sink or damage over 300 ships. The casualty rates are appalling. The fighting's ferocity convinces. American planners that invading the Japanaseum islands will cost potentially 1 million American casualties and kill millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians. This calculation drives the decision to use atomic weapons. On August 6, 1945, AB-29SUPRFORTRES, as named Enola Gay, drops a uranium-based atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion kills approximately 80,000 people instantly. 3 days later, another B-29 drops a plutonium-based bomb on Nagasaki, killing 40,000 immediately. Tens of thousands more die in subsequent weeks from radiation poisoning and injuries. The Japanese government surrenders on August 15, 1945. The Pacific War ends. Desmond Doss becomes the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. President Harry Truman presents it to him on October 12, 1945. In a White House ceremony, the citation reads, "He was a company aide man when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. PFC. Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands." The citation continues with additional acts of heroism from later battles. It describes how Doss was wounded by a grenade that shattered his legs and how he refused medical evacuation till another wounded soldier was treated first. It details how he was shot by a sniper while on a stretcher and how he treated his own injuries for 5 hours before reaching a medical station. The citation concludes, "Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching deterrence in the face of desperately dangerous conditions, PFC, Doss saved the lives of many soldiers." His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far above and beyond the call of duty. The citation does not mention that some of the wounded Doss treated were Japanese. This detail is considered irrelevant to his Medal of Honor qualification. He's being honored for saving American lives under fire, not for showing mercy to the enemy. But soldiers who serve with him know the full story. They remember seeing him bandage wounded Japanese soldiers. They remember him giving water to enemies who might have killed him. They remember that his compassion did not discriminate. Guy Gabaldon's story takes a different path. His capture of 1,500 Japanese prisoners makes him a legend within the Marine Corps. His superiors initially recommend him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation is downgraded to a Silver Star. Many believe this is because Gabaldon is Hispanic and because his methods, operating independently, disobeying orders, conducting unauthorized negotiations with the enemy, do not fit the narrative of conventional heroism. Years later, his Silver Star is upgraded to a Navy Cross, but he never receives the Medal of Honor he probably deserved. He spends 20 years living in Saipan after the war, married to a Japanese woman, building a life among the people he once fought. He dies in 2006, the same year as Desmond Doss died. The broader question of how to treat enemy wounded becomes part of the American military estimation of its conduct in the Pacific War. After the war, historians and military analysts study the fighting's brutality. They document atrocities committed by both sides. They note the dehumanization that made such atrocities possible. They examine how the Pacific War differed from the European theater, where surrender was common and prisoner treatment generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards. They identify factors that made the Pacific fighting uniquely savage: racial prejudice, cultural misunderstanding, the Japanese military's refusal to accept surrender, the isolated nature of island warfare, and the absence of conventional front lines where prisoners could be safely evacuated. These analyses lead to changes in training and doctrine. The U.S. military develops better protocols for handling prisoners. They create specialized interrogation units staffed by Japanese-speaking personnel. They implement more effective surrender appeals, using psychological warfare techniques. They emphasize that treating prisoners humanely produces better intelligence and reduces enemy will to resist. These lessons are applied in subsequent conflicts. In Korea, American forces accept mass surrenders of Chinese and North Korean troops and operate large POW camps. In Vietnam, despite that war's brutality, formal protocols for prisoner treatment are maintained. Though violations occur, the medical infrastructure supporting these decisions was itself remarkable. The U.S. military's medical corps in the Pacific War represented one of history's most sophisticated battle medicine systems. Combat medics like Desmond Doss carried aid bags containing morphine syringes, sulfa powder for infections, bandages, tourniquets, and plasma for shock treatment. They were trained to perform triage under fire, determining which wounded could be saved and which were beyond help. The medical chain extended from the frontline medic through battalion aid stations, field hospitals, hospital ships, and eventually to stateside medical facilities. This system saved thousands of lives that would have been lost in previous wars, yet the system was designed primarily for American casualties. Japanese wounded rarely entered this medical pipeline. Those who did were often severely injured prisoners evacuated for intelligence purposes rather than humanitarian care. The medical resources allocated to enemy casualties were minimal. Field hospitals treated American wounded first, second, and last. Japanese prisoners received care only after all American needs were met. This was official policy and practical necessity. Medical supplies were limited. Transport was limited. Hospital beds were limited. American commanders made the cold calculation that every resource expended on enemy wounded was one unavailable for American soldiers. This calculus created moral tension for medical personnel. Doctors and medics are trained to treat patients based on medical need, not nationality. The Hippocratic tradition demands that healers help whoever suffers. Military necessity demands that healers prioritize their own side. These imperatives conflict. Some medical personnel resolve the conflict by following orders without question. Others struggle with it. They see suffering and feel compelled to alleviate it regardless of the sufferer's uniform. Desmond Doss belonged to this second group. His medical training and his religious faith both taught him that alleviating suffering was a moral imperative that transcended military convenience. The question of individual moral choice in combat remains. Military organizations can establish policies and issue orders, but individual soldiers make decisions in moments of crisis. They choose to pull the trigger or lower the weapon. They choose to offer water or walk past. They choose to see an enemy or a human being. These choices define character. They determine whether soldiers return home as men who maintained their humanity or as men who lost it. Desmond Doss's choice on Hacksaw Ridge represents one answer to this question. Heck is to see every wounded person as deserving care regardless of uniform. This choice costs him nothing in material terms. He faces the same risks whether he treats American or Japanese wounded. But it costs him in a different way. Rendering aid to enemy soldiers uses just limited time and medical supplies. It exposes him to potential betrayal. It marks him as different from other soldiers who follow standard doctrine. Yet he persists because his faith means it. He cannot reconcile selective compassion. If killing is wrong, then allowing preventable death through inaction is also wrong. His conscience makes no exceptions for nationality or circumstance. Other soldiers make different choices, using equally valid reasoning. They see that resources are finite and must be allocated to American casualties first. They recognize that helping a wounded enemy soldier today might mean he recovers and kills Americans tomorrow. They understand that battlefield triage requires brutal pragmatism. Save those who have the best chance of survival and who serve your side's strategic interests. Spending time on enemy wounded is a luxury that combat does not afford. This perspective is defensible. It is the consensus view among combat troops. It reflects the reality that war forces impossible HSs between competing moral imperatives. The tension between these viewpoints never fully resolves. The U.S. military maintains its official position that enemy wounded will be treated humanely when tactically feasible. Individual soldiers continue to make their own determinations about what feasible means. Most prioritize American casualties. Some, like DOS, extend their care to everyone. The military accepts this variation as long as it does not interfere with mission accomplishment. Heroes are made from both groups. Soldiers who killed the enemy effectively and soldiers who showed mercy when killing would have been easier. The legacy of these choices extends beyond the individuals who made them. Stories like Desmond Doss's demonstrate that maintaining moral principles in extreme circumstances is possible. They prove that combat does not inevitably corrode character. They show that soldiers can fight effectively while still treating the enemy with a measure of humanity. This message resonates across subsequent generations. It influences military training that emphasizes rules of engagement and proper prisoner treatment. It shapes cultural narratives about what constitutes true heroism. It provides examples for soldiers facing similar moral dilemmas in later wars. The Japanese perspective on these encounters is largely lost to history. Few Japanese soldiers who received care from American medics survived to record their experiences. Japanese military records were destroyed in the war's final chaos. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans focused on combat operations rather than medical treatment received from enemies. But fragmentary accounts exist. Some Japanese prisoners of war expressed shock at the humane treatment they received. They had been told Americans would torture them. Instead, they found themselves in clean hospital beds, receiving antibiotics and surgery and adequate food. This cognitive dissonance was profound. Their entire worldview was built on the premise that surrender meant dishonor and suffering. When surrender instead brought relief and care, their psychological foundations collapsed. Some Japanese soldiers who encountered American medics in combat describe a moment of clarity. They are wounded, helpless, waiting for death. An American approaches. The Japanese soldier expects to be shot or bayoneted. Instead, the American renders aid. He applies bandages. He gives water. He administers morphine. For a brief moment, the war's propaganda dissolves and two humans interact without the filter of hatred. This moment does not last long. The wounded Japanese soldier is either evacuated to become a prisoner or headies of his wounds. But the moment exists. It proves that compassion is possible even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. The role of Japanese-American soldiers in facilitating these encounters deserves emphasis. The U.S. military recruited thousands of Nisei second generation Japanese Americans to serve as interpreters, intelligence specialists, and combat troops. Many of their families were interned in camps in the American West, imprisoned solely because of their ancestry. Yet these Nisei volunteered to fight for a country that had stripped them of their freedom and property. Their motivations were complex. Some sought to prove their loyalty. Some believed in American ideals despite the injustice they suffered. Some simply wanted to fight fascism. These Japanese-American soldiers played crucial roles in interrogating prisoners and translating captured documents. They also served as cultural intermediaries who could explain Japanese military thinking to American commanders. Some accompanied combatants and used loudspeakers to broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese. Others worked directly with prisoners, building rapport and extracting intelligence through careful questioning rather than coercion. Their contributions were immense but often unacknowledged. They faced suspicion from both sides: Americans who questioned their loyalty and Japanese who saw them as traitors. The counterpoint also matters. The Pacific War's brutality resulted partially from both sides' demonization of their enemies. When soldiers view their opponents as subhuman, atrocities become easier to commit and justify. When enemy wounded are automatically seen as ongoing threats rather than as injured humans, the default response becomes execution. This cycle perpetuates itself. Atrocities committed by one side justify retaliation by the other, which prompts further escalation. Breaking this cycle requires individuals who refuse to participate regardless of provocation. It requires soldiers who maintain that there are limits to acceptable conduct even in war. Desmond Doss represents this refusal. He will not kill even when ordered. He will not dedicate to wounded enemies, even when doctrine suggests he should. He establishes a personnel framework and adheres to it despite enormous pressure to conform. His example is uncomfortable for military organizations that require soldiers to follow orders without question, but it is also powerful because it demonstrates that ethical behavior under fire is achievable. Doss is not weak or cowardly. He is extraordinarily brave. His bravery simply takes a different form than conventional military valor. He risks death to save lives rather than take them. This is no less courageous than charging a machine gun nest. The equipment and technology available to combat medics in 1945 represented significant advance over previous wars but remained primitive by modern standards. Plasma 4. Treating shock was a recent innovation, only widely available in the Pacific Theater from 1943 onward. Before plasma, shock victims often died from blood loss, even when their wounds were otherwise survivable. Sulfa drugs provided the first effective antibiotic treatment for bacterial infections. Morphine allowed pain management in the field. But medics lacked many tools modern paramedics consider essential. They had no intravenous fluids beyond plasma. They had no way to intubate patients with airway compromise. They had no cardiac medications, no advanced airway management, no real-time monitoring equipment. Transporting wounded from battlefield to surgical hospital was crude and dangerous. Litter bearers carried casualties over rough terrain while under fire. Jeeps equipped as ambulance provide slightly faster transport but could not traverse many areas. The wounded endured hours of jostling over unimproved roads, their pain barely controlled by morphine. Many casualties who survived their initial wounds died during evacuation from shock, blood loss, or complications. The mortality rate for severe wounds far exceeded modern combat survival rates. Despite the dedication of medical personnel, the surgical hospitals that treated evacuated casualties represented mobile medical miracles. Army and Navy surgeons performed complex operations in tents pitched near the front lines. They operated for 12 to 16 hours continuously during major battles, pausing only when casualties stopped arriving. They had basic anesthesia, antibiotics, and surgical instruments, but lacked blood banks, advanced imaging, and intensive care capabilities. Yet they achieved remarkable results. Soldiers who would have died in previous wars survived PCOWs. Forward surgical teams could stabilize them within hours of wounding, rather. Then days. Japanese medical capabilities in the Pacific War were significantly inferior to American capabilities. The Japanese military medical corps was smaller, less well-equipped, and less effective. Japanese wounded often received minimal care. Antibiotics were scarce. Anesthesia was limited. Many Japanese soldiers died from wounds that American medical care would have survived. This disparity meant that a wounded Japanese soldier who received care from an American medic had a better survival chance than if treated by his own medical corps. This was not lost on some Japanese prisoners who expressed gratitude for American medical treatment that saved their lives. The role of Navy hospital ships in the Pacific War deserves special mention. These vessels, marked with red crosses and theoretically protected by Geneva Convention provisions, evacuated severely wounded casualties from forward areas to rear hospitals. They provided the highest level of medical care available in the Pacific theater, with full surgical suites, X-ray equipment, blood banks, and specialized physicians. They were also targets. Despite their protected status, several hospital ships were attacked by Japanese forces, some deliberately. The sinking of hospital ships and the killing of medical personnel represented war crimes, but they occurred nonetheless, further hardening attitudes on both sides. The question of what changed when that Marine on Iwo Jima lowered his weapon comes down to this. He chose to see a human rather than a target. That choice required courage because it violated doctrine and invited judgment from his peers. It required moral clarity because it rejected the easy path of following orders without thought. It required recognition that how wars are fought matters as much as their outcomes. Victories purchased through atrocity are morally compromised. Wars won through brutality create veterans who carry shame along with their medals. The Pacific War's end brought relief and horror in equal measure. The atomic bombings ended the fighting and likely prevented the enormous casualties an invasion of Japan would have caused. But they also introduced weapons that could destroy humanity entirely. Their revelation of Japanese atrocities against prisoners shocked the American public. The discovery that American troops had sometimes committed similar acts, though on a much smaller scale, complicated the narrative of moral superiority. The war's accounting was brutal. Millions dead, entire cities destroyed, wounds both physical and psychological that would last lifetimes. Yet within that carnage were moments of grace. A medic who refused to abandon wounded deadmen. A Marine who convinced enemies to surrender rather than die pointlessly. A soldier who shared water with a dying enemy. These moments did not change the war's outcome. They did not prevent atrocities or reduce casualties significantly, but they mattered because they proved that humanity could survive war. They demonstrated that soldiers could maintain ethical standards even in the most extreme circumstances. They showed that mercy was possible even toward those who showed none. The psychological wounds carried by Pacific War veterans often exceeded their physical injuries. Men who fought in the island campaigns returned home with what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock, what modern medicine recognizes as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about banzai charges and kamikaze attacks. They startled at loud noises. They struggled to reconcile the brutality they had witnessed and participated in with the peaceful civilian lives they were trying to rebuild. Some turned to alcohol to numb their memories. Others withdrew into silence, refusing to speak about their experiences. Many carried guilt about acts committed in combat or comrades they failed to save. The veterans who maintained their moral standards during the war often adapted better to civilian life. Desmond Doss never suffered the guilt that plagued many combat veterans, as he never killed anyone. He saved lives. His memories, while traumatic, were not morally compromising. He could look back on his service and know he had adhered to his principles, even under extreme pressure. This gave him peace that eluded many veterans. Guy Gabaldon similarly found meaning in his wartime actions. He had saved lives on both sides. His capture of Japanese prisoners prevented battles that would have killed hundreds. This gave his service a redemptive quality that sustained him in later years. Contrast this with veterans who committed atrocities or simply killed without moral reflection. Some carried no guilt. They believed their actions were justified by military necessity and enemy behavior. But others were haunted. They remembered executing prisoners. They remembered bayoneting wounded men. They remembered acts of cruelty that seemed necessary in the moment but monstrous in retrospect. These memories corroded their souls. They could not speak of them to anyone who had not experienced combat. They certainly could not discuss them with civilian family members who viewed the war as a righteous crusade. So they buried the memories and lived with the silent burden. The U.S. military provided minimal psychological support for returning veterans. Mental health care in 1945 was primitive by modern standards. The prevailing attitude was that soldiers would simply readjust to civilian life without dwelling on their wartime experiences. Veterans who sought help for psychological problems were often stigmatized as weak. Many suffered insolence rather than face this judgment. The full psychological toll of the Pacific War would not be recognized for decades. Desmond Doss survived the war, but spent years recovering from his wounds. Tuberculosis crack from exposure on Okinawa cost him a lung and 5 ribs. He lived until 2006, dying at age 87, long enough to see his story told in books and films. He never claimed to be a hero. He said he was simply doing what his faith required. This humility made his heroism more profound. He did not seek recognition or reward. He did what he believed was right and accepted the consequences. The wounded Japanese soldiers he treated on Hacksaw Ridge have no names in American records. They are statistical casualties, numbers in after-action reports. Their families likely never learned what happened to them. They probably died of their wounds or in subsequent fighting. Doss's care may have extended their lives by hours or days, no more. Yet the act of rendering that care remains significant. It was an assertion of common humanity in circumstances designed to deny it. It was resistance against the dehumanization that makes worst atrocities possible. It was a choice to remain human when becoming a machine would have been easier. The broader strategic implications of showing mercy to enemy wounded remain debatable. Some military theorists argue that humane treatment of prisoners encouraged surrender and saves lives on both sides. If enemy soldiers believe they will be treated well if captured, they are more likely to surrender rather than fight to the death. This was certainly true in the European theater, where German soldiers frequently surrendered to American forces. In the Pacific theater, the effectiveness of this strategy was limited by deep cultural factors and Japanese military indoctrination. Even when American forces demonstrated they would treat prisoners humanely, most Japanese soldiers still chose death. However, the few successful prisoner captures did provide valuable intelligence. Japanese soldiers who surrendered often gave detailed information about enemy positions, strength, morale, and tactics. This intelligence saved American lives by allowing more effective edging of enemy formations. The intelligence value of prisoners meant that efforts to encourage surrender had practical military benefits beyond humanitarian concerns. Commanders who recognized this began to emphasize prisoner capture in their operational planning. Special interrogation teams were formed. Surrender appeals became more sophisticated. Prisoners who cooperated received better treatment, creating incentives for others to surrender. The propaganda value of humanely treating prisoners also mattered. The United States was fighting a war, in part over ideological principles: democracy versus militarism, individualism versus totalitarianism. Demonstrating moral superiority through humane treatment of prisoners reinforced these principles. It showed that American values remained intact even in war's crucible. This mattered for domestic morale and international perception. It provided evidence that America was fighting for something beyond mere national interest. Yet these strategic and propaganda benefits should not obscure the fundamental moral question. Do humans have obligations to enemy wounded simply because they are human? This question transcends military utility. It addresses whether war eliminates all moral constraints, or whether some constraints persist regardless of circumstances. Desmond answered this question through his actions. He treated enemy wounded not because it provided intelligence or propaganda benefits, but because his conscience demanded it. This made his compassion pure rather than calculated. It was moral action divorced from strategic consideration. This is what changed when soldiers looked at wounded enemies and saw people rather than targets. They reclaimed their own humanity. They resisted the psychological damage fake viewing humans as things inflicts. They created memories they could live with rather than memories that would haunt them. They established that they fought for principles, not just for victory. They demonstrated that American values included showing mercy even to those who might not deserve it. The Pacific War tested these values more severely than any conflict in American history. The fighting's ferocity, the enemy's fanaticism, the cultural gulf between the combatants, and war's brutality all combined to create conditions where atrocities seemed inevitable. Yet individuals like Desmond Doss proved they were not. They showed that soldiers could maintain moral standards even under the most extreme pressure. They demonstrated that compassion could coexist with combat effectiveness. They established that being humane didn't mean being weak. This legacy influences the American military to this day. Training emphasizes rules of engagement and proper prisoner treatment. War crimes are prosecuted rather than ignored. Soldiers are taught that maintaining ethical standards serves both moral and practical purposes. It preserves their own humanity, and it reduces enemy willingness to fight to the death. The lessons of the Pacific War, both the atrocities and the acts of mercy, inform their military conduct. They remind soldiers that they will be judged not just on whether they won, but on how they fought. The specific mechanics of battlefield medicine in the Pacific War illustrate why showing mercy to enemy wounded was so difficult. Combat medics operated under conditions that modern medical professionals would find incomprehensible. They worked in mud, rain, and extreme heat. Sanitation was impossible. Wounds were contaminated with dirt, coral fragments, and volcanic ash. Infections were nearly inevitable. Medics applied sulfur powder to wounds, but it provided limited protection against tropical diseases and bacteria. Many wounded soldiers served their initial injuries only to die days later from infection, gangrene, or tropical disease like malaria and dysentery. The medical supplies medics carried were strictly rationed. Each medic received a fixed allocation of morphine syringes, bandages, plasma, and sulfur powder. Once these were exhausted, they had to rely on field resupply, which was often delayed or disrupted by combat. This created agonizing decisions. If a medic used morphine on an enemy wounded soldier, that syringe was unavailable for the next American casualty. If he used bandages on a Japanese soldier with survivable wounds, he might lack bandages when an American soldier needed them. These were not hypothetical dilemmas. They occurred constantly. Medics had to triage not just based on injury severity, but also on nationality. Desmond Doss somehow transcended these constraints. Fellow medics reported that he seemed to have endless supplies despite carrying a standard aid bag. He gave away his water, food, and medical supplies freely. When his supplies were exhausted, he improvised using torn clothing as bandages, carrying wounded men when he lacked litters, keeping casualties warm with his own body heat. His physical stamina seemed superhuman. He weighed 140 pounds, but carried wounded men who weighed far more. He operated for 12 hours straight on Hacksaw Ridge without food, water, or rest. Other soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Doss continued until every wounded man was evacuated. The rope system he devised for lowering casualties down Hacksaw Ridge's cliff face demonstrated his practical ingenuity. The escarpment was nearly vertical in places, approximately 400 feet high. Standard litters could not be lowered safely. They would tangle or flip. Doss fashioned a rope sling using a double bow-end knot that distributed weight evenly and prevented the wounded soldier from sliding free. He tied the rope to a tree stump at that cliff edge and lowered each man hand over hand. The rope burned through his palms, leaving permanent scars. His hands bled continuously. Still, he persisted. 75 times he teed knot, lowered a wounded soldier, and pulled the rope back up. This physical feat alone qualifies as extraordinary. The tactical situation on Hacksaw Ridge that day made his actions even more remarkable. The Japanese counterattack came in multiple waves. Enemy soldiers were not simply defending positions. They were actively hunting American wounded. Japanese doctrine helped at eliminating enemy casualties, prevented them from being evacuated, treated, and driven to combat. Finishing wounded enemies was considered tactically sound. Several Japanese soldiers carried clubs for this purpose, conserving ammunition by bludgeoning wounded Americans. Doss worked among these hunters, somehow evading detection, despite moving continuously across open ground. Multiple accounts describe Japanese soldiers passing within feet of Doss while he treated wounded men. He would freeze in place, lying flat among the bodies, while enemy soldiers moved past. Some accounts suggest divine protection, that God blinded the Japanese to Doss's presence. More prosaically, the chaos of battle, poor visibility from smoke and dust, and the sheer number of bodies on the battlefield may have provided concealment. Whatever its mechanism, Doss repeatedly survived situations that should have resulted in his death. The unnamed Marine, who lowered his weapon on Iwo Jima, made that choice for his own reasons. Perhaps he remembered his own religious training. Perhaps he simply felt compassion for a dying man. Perhaps he calculated that the wounded enemy posed no threat and killing him served no purpose. Whatever his motivation, his choice illustrated a fundamental truth. War does not eliminate moral agency. Soldiers retain the ability to choose how they respond to circumstances. They can follow doctrine blindly, or they can think independently. They can become killing machines, or they can remain humans who sometimes must kill. The difference matters. The post-war reconciliation between former enemies adds another dimension to these stories of mercy. Many veterans who fought in the Pacific, including some who showed compassion to enemy wounded, later developed relationships with former Japanese soldiers. Exchange programs brought American and Japanese veterans together decades after the war. Initial meetings were tense and awkward. Men who had tried to kill each other faced each other in peaceful settings. Some found they could not bridge the gap. Others discovered common ground in shared suffering and survival. Desmond Doss never met the Japanese soldiers whose lives he saved. They likely died off their wounds or in subsequent fighting. He never knew their names or whether his treatment texted their lives by hours, days, or not at all. This uncertainty did not diminish the significance of his actions. He acted according to principle, without regard for outcome. This is the essence of moral courage, doing what is right because it is right, not because it produces measurable benefit. Guy Gabaldon, by contrast, lived among Japanese people for 2 decades after the war. He married a Japanese woman. He raised his children in Saipan. the island where he had convinced hundreds of Japanese soldiers to surrender. He became fluent in Japanese and immersed in Japanese culture. His post-war life represented a form of reconciliational label to most veterans. He transformed from an enemy who killed Japanese soldiers to a resident who lived peacefully among Japanese civilians. This transition was possible because he had chosen mercy over maximum violence during the war. He had taken prisoners rather than executing them. This choice allowed him to live without the burden of unnecessary killing. The broader process of American-Japanese reconciliation after World War II is one of history's remarkable transformations. Two nations that had fought with savage intensity became close allies within a decade of the war's end. This reconciliation was driven by geopolitical factors. The Cold War made Japan a crucial American ally against Soviet expansion, but it was facilitated by individuals on both sides who chose to move beyond wartime hatred. Veterans who could have nursed grievances instead chose understanding. Japanese civilians who could have resented occupation instead accepted American assistance in rebuilding. This collective choice to forgive and move forward prevented the kind-of lingering animosity that might have poisoned the region for generations. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki complicated this reconciliation. The bombs ended the war but killed over 200,000 people, mostly civilians. Japanese survivors, Kawadabacha, suffered lasting physical and psychological trauma. Some Americans felt guilt about the bombings. Others believed they were necessary to end the war without a costly invasion. This debate continues. What is clear is that veterans who fought in the ground campaigns understood viscerally what an invasion of Japan would have cost. They had experienced the fanatical resistance on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. They knew that an invasion off home islands would have resulted in millions of casualties on both sides. Many ground combat veterans supported the decision to use atomic weapons because they believed it saved their lives and the lives of their comrades who would have been ordered to invade. The legacy of individual acts of mercy during the war provided small but important counterparts to the bombing's horror. Stories of American soldiers showing compassion to Japanese wounded demonstrated that even in war's darkest moments, humanity persisted. These stories did not erase the war's brutality or justify its excesses, but they provided evidence that individuals retained moral agency, even when institutional structure encouraged atrocity. They showed that some soldiers maintained ethical standards regardless of provocation. This mattered in the post-war period, when both nations were trying to construct narratives about the war that allowed them to move forward. The modern relevance of these historical lessons extends beyond American-Japan's relations. Every subsequent conflict has faced similar questions about how to treat enemy wounded and prisoners. The wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan all brought said soldiers who had to decide whether to show mercy or maximum violence. Some made the same choice Desmond Doss made. Others did not. The circumstances varied, but the fundamental moral question remained constant. Does common humanity persist even in combat, or does war reduce humans to mere targets? Modern military training explicitly addresses these questions in ways the World War II military did not. Contemporary soldiers receive extensive instruction on rules of engagement, proper treatment of prisoners, and war crimes. They are taught that maintaining ethical standards serves both moral and practical purposes. They learn that atrocities create enemies, harden resistance, and ultimately prolong conflicts. They are shown historical examples, including stories from the Pacific War, that illustrate the consequences of both ethical and unethical conduct. Yet knowledge does not always translate to action. Soldiers in combat still face the same pressures that Pacific War veterans faced: fear, hatred, desire for revenge, peer pressure, and the brutal calculus of kill or be killed. Training and rules cannot eliminate these pressures. They can only provide tools for resisting them. Individual soldiers still must make individual choices in moments of crisis. The example of soldiers like Desmond Doss provides a template but not a guarantee. Each person must find their own capacity for mercy under fire. The technological changes in warfare since 1945 have both eased and complicated these moral questions. Modern battlefield medicine is far more effective than 1945 medicine. Combat medics can perform advanced trauma care in the field. Helicopters can evacuate casualties within minutes. Surgical hospitals can treat injuries that would have been fatal in World War II. This improved care applies to enemy wounded as well. Modern U.S. military policy requires that enemy casualties receive the same standard of medical care as American casualties. This represents progress, though implementation remains imperfect. Yet modern warfare's distance and technology create new moral hazards. Drone operators kill enemies from thousands of miles away. Precision munitions strike targets with minimal direct human contact. This distance can make killing easier by insulating the killer from the killed. There is no moment where a soldier looks into an enemy's eyes and chooses mercy or violence. The decision is made remotely, abstractly, digitally. This reduces the immediate psychological cost of killing, but may increase the long-term moral hazard by making violence seem clean and consequence-free. The Pacific War's close-quarters combat, by contrast, forced soldiers to confront the humanity of those they killed. They saw faces. They heard voices. They witnessed death up close. This made killing psychologically harder, but also made mercy possible. A soldier standing over a wounded enemy had to make a conscious choice. He could not hide behind technology or distance. He bore full responsibility for his decision. This immediate moral responsibility, while traumatic, also provided opportunities for moral courage that modern warfare may not. The enduring power of Desmond Doss's story lies in its demonstration of sustained moral courage under extreme circumstances. He did not make one brave choice. He made thousands of small choices over months of combat, each time choosing to uphold his principles despite enormous pressure to abandon them. He faced ridicule, hostility, and death threats from his own comrades. He endured combat without the psychological comfort of being able to defend himself with weapons. He risked his life to save others, including enemies. This sustained courage over time is more impressive than isolated acts of heroism. It represents a way of living rather than a moment of glory. The soldiers. Desmond Doss saved the 75 men lowered down Hacksaw Ridge. The hundreds treated throughout the Okinawa campaign went on to live full lives because of his choices. They married, had children, built careers, grew old. Their descendants number in thousands. An entire extended family of humans exists because one slight medic refused to abandon wounded men. This is mercy's arithmetic. One choice, 75 lives, 1,000 soft descendants. The ripple effects of moral action extend far beyond the immediate moment. The Japanese soldiers Doss treated had no such extended legacy. Most died. But their deaths were perhaps slightly less painful because someone gave them water and morphine. Someone treated them as humans in their final moments. This kindness, however small, mattered. It represented resistance against the dehumanization that war demands. It prevented seeing the enemy as human was possible, even in the Pacific War's extremity. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.